Allison, I see your name. Welcome. I'm Onur.
Hi.
Hi. So we can actually get started. Let me introduce Allison Dods to the audience, and then I'll give the word to you. So Allison Dods, by the way, congratulations on your HSP acceptance. I heard
Thank
from
you.
So Allison Dods, a PhD student of linguistics at University of Maryland, and she kindly agreed to give us a presentation on how language models acquire languages, or can they, with the case of filler gap dependencies. So thank you for accepting our invitation, and I'll give the word to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Let me try and share. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, great. Okay, am I sharing my screen?
We don't see it now, but
Why is it telling me that I am? Okay. Sorry. Okay, I'm not super used to Google Meet, and I thought I clicked share, but I guess it's not sharing my screen.
It does that sometimes. You have to reconnect, like refresh the page and come back and try again.
Okay.
I think that'll work.
Okay, let me try sharing again.
Now
Okay,
we can see
great.
it. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right, can you guys see my slides now?
Yeah, we can see the slide.
Okay, great. Let me just keep track of the time. Okay, so yeah, thank you guys for having me. My name's Allison. I am a PhD student in linguistics at the University of Maryland. I'm in my second year. And before this, I was at Microsoft working on responsible NLP. So I'm really excited about this talk series. It touches on a lot of things I'm really interested in. Right now, I mostly work on psycholinguistics, computational linguistics, and language acquisition. And what I'm going to talk to you guys about today is kind of in the intersection of all of those things. So we're going to look at what language models might be able to tell us about language acquisition.
Listen, so sorry to interrupt, but we don't see the slides now. We only see
no.
the
Seriously?
page. Now we can see it.
Is that better? Okay, well, we're just going to do it like this then.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So I'm going to be talking about some ongoing work that I've been doing with some other students at Maryland, Catherine Howitt, Satvik Nair, and Robert Hopkins. And I'm not going to talk too much about the specifics of our work. Really, what I want to do is kind of talk at a high level about the kinds of approaches that I think you can take with language models to investigate this aspect of language. But a lot of my thinking and a lot of what I'm going to report has been a group effort. So yeah, just to kind of situate and get everybody's mind in the right space. Of course, we're going to be talking about language models, but also a little bit about acquisition and a little bit about syntax. And so I'm going to say some things about each of these spaces, just so everyone has enough knowledge to be able to kind of follow the logic of some of the background research. But I'm not going to go into too much detail. Again, I kind of want this to be pretty high level. But we're going to be right in the middle of these topics. Okay, so I want to start with the sort of main question that I'm interested in, that I kind of want to use to guide this talk, which is what abstract generalizations can be extracted from natural language without linguistic bias. And by linguistic bias, I'm referring to the bias that the learner has. So in humans, that's a child. And in AI, that would be a language model. And I'm going to go through this question like piece by piece and just explain what I mean by each of these components. So even if it's not super clear, right now. Hopefully it'll be a bit clearer in like 5 or 10 minutes. So starting with the notion of abstract generalizations, I just want to talk about what I mean by that. Just thinking generally about human cognition, humans have this ability to generalize from observed data in our environment. So that could mean different things depending on whether you're looking at like vision or reasoning or other aspects of cognition. But in language, it might mean something like our ability to generate novel sentences or produce novel sentences that we've never heard before. Or if someone else speaks a sentence, we can recognize it as being grammatical or ungrammatical, even if we've never heard that sentence before. So there's something that we've learned from our environment that helps us predict the grammaticality of new sentences, basically. One hypothesis among psycholinguists is that these generalizations are supported by abstract representations. And so what I mean by that, like if you kind of look at this example down below.
I'm sorry, the slides are gone.
The slides are gone again? Oh no. Okay.
I think you stopped the presentation. Screen sharing.
That's odd. Okay. Let's try. Let me try one thing. I'm going to separate my Google Meet from my slides and see if that gets any better. Okay. Are you guys seeing it now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Still?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So, yeah, like I was saying, I want to just clarify this idea of what I mean by abstract representations. So if you have these sentences in English, like she walks the dog and my friend slept, and the students and their parents sign the waiver, and you can have an infinite number of sentences that are different in their surface form, but we have this idea that they have something in common. And in English, what that is that they are structured in terms of a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, right? And so one thing that would make it maybe more convenient or easier for a learner to store all of their linguistic knowledge is if instead of storing each of these sentences individually, they're storing an abstract pattern like noun phrase, verb phrase, and then every new sentence you encounter, you can break it down in terms of that abstract structure and see whether it matches your expectations for what's a grammatical sentence. So this hopefully isn't new to anybody. I'm not saying anything super complicated here, just that in order to think about these sort of abstract groupings, they're not necessarily like transparently obvious from the surface form of the language, right? So people aren't walking around saying noun phrase, verb phrase, they're saying these specific sentences. And if we have abstract representations, then our job is to infer what those are from the literal specific surface sentences. Okay, so back to the main question. We've talked about what I mean by what abstract generalizations are. And now we're going to talk about how they might be learned. And I think of this as a bidirectional question. So in order to understand how a learner, like a person or a language model, learns these generalizations from data, you have to say something about the learner and also something about the data. And that's what I'm going to do next, is just kind of talk about some assumptions about properties of the language and properties of the learner that might support that learning. So hopefully this becomes a little more clear. So in saying that things can be extracted from natural language, I want to talk about one of those directions first, which is describing the properties of the language itself. So if you are a generative linguist, then you might say that the language that's produced in the world was generated by certain principled rules, and that those rules that produced the data might be inferable by the statistical distributions that they leave in the data. And so you can think by analogy about, like, if you're a statistician, you're presented with a bunch of data and you might in some sense, work backwards from the posterior distributions to figure out what caused those distributions in the first place. So that's the kind of thing that I'm suggesting here, is that you're presented with, if you're a human learner, you're going to hear sentences like, you know that he is going to stop by. What do you think he likes to eat, etc. And even in these small fragments, there's already patterns. And so if you can group those patterns together, you might be able to figure out what rules might have produced them in the first place. So in this case, we have pronouns that are followed by verbs. We have a third person pronoun that is that agrees with its verb, and it agrees the same way over here, right? So again, hopefully not anything new that I'm saying here, but basically you're not given the rules themselves, you're given the output of those rules, right? And so to figure out what the rules are, you kind of have to figure out how to work backwards from the produced language data. And I keep saying data, and basically all I mean is the language that you encounter in your environment. So spoken or written or signed, just everything that you come into contact with as a learner. Okay, so that was the thinking about the learning problem in terms of the data itself. And then we also have to think about the properties of the learner. And so like I said, when I'm talking about linguistic bias, I'm talking about what biases the learner has. So linguistic bias here refers to the sort of longstanding debate in language acquisition about whether or not humans are born with certain linguistic specific expectations. So universal grammar is an example of that. So on the one hand, you have a hypothesis that humans come into the world and they have these general cognitive capacities to recognize patterns and be able to form generalizations, and those are enough to be able to learn language. And on the other hand, you have the hypothesis that there needs to be something specific that is especially geared towards language as a type of cognitive data. So one way that I like to think about this that helps me is to kind of put it in computational terms and to think about like the input is structured a certain way. Like I said a couple slides ago, that might be because it's produced by certain rules, right? So the input has certain properties and certain structures. And as a learner, you have expectations about what structure you are expecting to see and how you are equipped to organize the data. So a kind of really simplistic example would be like if you have a machine that's trained to recognize the difference between the color yellow and the color blue, and then you give it one of those colors, it's like, great, I know what to do. But if you give it like the color red, it's like, this isn't the format, this isn't the type of data I was expecting to see, so I don't really know what to do. So based on the learner's, like the format of the learner's expectations, if they line up with the format of the data, you may be better or worse at recognizing the patterns that are in the data and then being able to draw those generalizations. So the question, to put it in these terms, is if all you have is sort of general cognitive expectations, are those sufficient to extract the patterns from language? Like, do those formats match up, basically? Where language models come in is I have an assumption, as do a lot of other people in the literature, that language models are linguistically neutral. And I'm borrowing this term from a recent paper from Nurlan et al. And the idea here is that we're saying that language models don't have the kind of built-in overt linguistic bias that linguists posit when they're talking about like universal grammar, right? Language models, even though what the thing that they're doing is working with language, right? Like we call them language models. The underlying representations are in principle, they don't have to be linguistic, right? You can use language models to work with other kinds of data. So if this assumption is correct, that language models are linguistically neutral and they lack linguistic bias, then you can use them as a sort of comparison or foil for humans and test hypotheses about what is in principle possible if you don't have linguistic bias. You might not buy into this assumption. If you don't, I'm not going to be talking that much about it, but I might be able to point you to other things to read. Yeah, it is a huge assumption, right? So I just want to be clear about that. So just coming back to the main question and sort of recapping, what we're going to be talking about is these abstract generalizations in language and whether or not a learner that doesn't have linguistic bias is able to recognize them and pull them out of the language data. A key sort of piece of logic here is that if you have a non-linguistically biased learner, like a language model, and it's able to extract a certain generalization, then linguistic bias isn't necessary to learn that generalization, right? So we're trying to figure out which phenomena are only able to be learned if you had some sort of linguistically specific expectation for how to process that data. Okay, so talking a little bit more about language models and their use in this kind of work. So why might we think language models might be useful or interesting here? So like I said before, we assume that they lack linguistic bias, so we have that kind of comparison point, whereas with humans, we just don't know. They allow for a great amount of scale in the amount of data you're able to look at. So there's been work that essentially says like, look, a language model is getting billions and billions of tokens and it's still not learning some fact about language, then like how could a human possibly learn it without bias, right? Like that's the kind of logic that comes up in this literature. But what's more interesting to me is that language models allow for a certain type of control when you're running experiments that is really hard to get with human subjects. So especially in human acquisition research, we just aren't able to see every single piece of language that a child is exposed to. I guess you could like put a camera on a kid for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but that would be, expensive and also have ethical issues. So what we can do instead is just try and infer, like we can ask the parent what kinds of words the kid hears or what kind of words the kids produce. And we can expose the kid to specific constructions when they come into the lab, but we're still missing a large amount of context. We don't know what it is the kid has heard. Whereas with language models, we still have a little bit of that issue because we can't see everything that's in the training data, but we have some idea of like the scope of the training data. Like, oh, this model was trained on Wikipedia, so like this is the kind of language that it might have been exposed to. The other thing we can do with language models is retrain them. So then we have more tight control over what kind of data we're giving to them. In this literature, you're going to see surprisal a lot. That might be something that's already familiar to some of you. I'm going to talk more about what it is in a second, but basically there's some work to suggest that measurements like surprisal might correlate to some extent with human behavioral effects, like psycholinguistic processes, or not the processes themselves, but the output of those processes. And so you might be able to start to draw some loose comparisons between what the models are doing and what humans might be doing. And I really want to strongly caveat that I don't see language models as being a sort of direct comparison. So understanding what a model is doing, I don't think really tells you very much at all about what a human is doing. And so I want to be very careful. Some people will disagree with me on that, but this is very much the standpoint that I'm coming from. Instead, what I think is interesting about language models is that they have something in common with humans, which is that their input is human language, natural language. And that's our input too, right? Like the natural language is an object that both humans and language models interact with. And so I think in an ideal world, you can use language models to understand properties of the language, and then from there, maybe figure out something about how humans are interacting with that language. So not from language model to human, but from language model to language, and then from that to human. So just before we get into this sort of measurement of surprisal that I was talking about, I just want to briefly cover some background about what's going on with language models. I'm not going to get into too much detail or make this very technical. I also imagine a lot of you know this stuff pretty deeply already. But basically what language models are doing is predicting the probability of a word in a sequence given some context. And the probability is coming from the training data that the model's been exposed to. and the statistical patterns. So words that you see more often, very, very roughly and simplistically, are going to be more probable. Because the language model is exposed to natural language data, we can assume, although I'm not entirely sure if this is true, but a sort of intuitive assumption would be that grammatical phrases and sentences are more common in the training data than ungrammatical ones are, just because humans are mostly going around producing grammatical forms. And so the intuition is that a grammatical form is going to be more predictable than an ungrammatical form. So if you ask the model to continue the sentence, it's more likely to continue it with something grammatical. And we're going to get into like complications with that statement in a little bit, but that's kind of the overall intuition behind looking at surprisal, I think. And so if we want to figure out how predictable a word is for a model, we can use this measurement of surprisal. Essentially what it is the negative log probability of a word given context. I'm not, again, going to get into technical definitions, but the intuition is that if a word has low probability, it'll have high surprisal. And so if you kind of personify a language model, the idea is that if the model did not think that the word is likely, that it's going to be surprised to see that word. And there's some work to suggest that surprisal correlates with human reading times in psycholinguistic studies. And so again, intuitively and loosely, you can kind of think about as a human, if you're reading a sentence word by word and you get to a word that seems wrong for some reason, you're going to be surprised and you're going to slow down in reading. Again, I'm stating that very generally. That's not always the case. So I'm going to be using the word know to talk about language models. It's just shorthand for whether surprisal in a language model lines up with human-like expectations of grammaticality. I'm not making any claims about like a language model's cognitive status or anything like that. So for example, if a language model knows or has learned subject-verb agreement, then we'd expect to see in a sentence like the first one, which is grammatical, if you measure surprisal when you get to the word eat, so I eat, you would expect to see low surprisal, because that's not weird. And if you had an ungrammatical continuation like I eats, where the subject-verb agreement is wrong, then you would expect to see higher surprisal if a language model is behaving somewhat akin to how a human would expect these sentences to be continued. So using that sort of logic of surprisal, there's been a good amount of work in the last couple of years about what language models know about natural language syntax. I think most of it in English. And there's some evidence to suggest that language models aren't necessarily just spitting back out linear patterns, but that they are able to represent some amount of hierarchy that's not present in the linear surface form of a sentence. So I'm going to be talking about filler gap dependencies as one kind of case study or example of a hierarchical nonlinear sentence phenomenon. And the evidence for whether or not language models know this is pretty mixed. And so I think it's really interesting. And I think there's nuances in like what we can learn about language and what we can learn about language models from studying this. So we'll walk through it. First, I just want to give a quick overview of what I mean here by filler gap dependencies. Again, this is going to be familiar probably to a number of people in the room, but I just want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page about the phenomenon. So here's an example of a filler gap dependency in English. This first sentence, this cake Mary bought. This is an example of topicalization, right? So canonically in English, the object follows the verb, but if you want to topicalize it and make it more prominent, you can move the object up to the front of the sentence. Not everyone can do this. I actually don't do this very often, but you know, we're gonna buy it for now as a phenomenon in English. So where the words filler and gap come from is that there's a relationship between this fronted component, this cake, and the space next to the verb. And so I'm going to be illustrating that with an underline, but obviously in regular natural language, it's just silence. And if you adhere to a movement theory of syntax, then the way you might sort of conceptualize this is that the phrase "this cake" started off next to the verb and then it like moved somewhere else, right? So it maintains some sort of relationship with its original position. Not everybody describes this in terms of movement, but any theory of syntax, I think, needs to have some explanation for the syntactic and semantic relationship between what we call the filler and the gap position. So I hope that's kind of clear. There's other kinds of filler gap constructions. A couple other examples here. We have topicalization, which I just mentioned. We have embedded WH questions. So in this one, the phrase "this cake" gets replaced by a word like "what" or "who" or "when." So they're called WH questions just because those words in English tend to start with WH. We have clefting, which is in English, it is this cake that Mary bought. It's not that cake, for instance. And another one is tough constructions. So this cake is tough to eat, or this book is easy to read, or something like that. And the insight I want to kind of draw out here is that these are all literally different sentences, right? But they have something in common, which is that they have this component called the filler, which has a relationship to another part of the sentence where it doesn't literally show up. And in this case, a further sort of thing they all have in common is that the component is nominal and it has some relationship to the main verb of the sentence. But I don't think that's that specific, is that important for the rest of the work. Just the key point is that like you can conceive of a generalization here, right? That kind of binds together all of these different types of constructions. So humans have certain expectations about how the filler and the gap should behave. And I'm going to use topicalization again to illustrate that. So if you look at these green boxes, I have a sort of matrix here where we have the presence of the filler and the absence, and then the presence of the gap and the absence of the gap. So when the filler and the gap are both in the sentence, it should be good. It's grammatical. And if you wanted to phrase it in terms of surprisal, you should not be surprised. This is a perfectly fine sentence with both filler and the gap. In this other green box down here, I've removed the filler and I've replaced it with just like a random phrase just to balance out the string. So we have, "In fact, Mary bought the cheese." This is also a perfectly fine sentence. We have no filler and no gap, so that's fine. But when we have a gap with no filler, like in the upper right corner, "In fact, Mary bought." This is an ungrammatical sentence. Bought is a transitive word. And so you can't just have a gap with no filler. So that should be bad, and you should be surprised, right? When you get to the end of the sentence, you're like, wait, I didn't see the object. That's surprising, or, it should bother you in some way. And likewise, if you have a filler but no gap, so like in this sentence, "This cake Mary bought the cheese," now you have a filler, but the place where the gap would be is taken up by another noun phrase. So this is also bad. And if you were reading the sentence word by word and you got to the phrase "the cheese," you'd be like, hang on, this is weird, right? I was expecting there to be nothing because I already saw "this cake." So this is what humans do. And the question is this what language models do? Because if you want to say that a language model has learned the filler gap relationship, then it should consider the good sentences good and the bad sentences bad in terms of surprisal. Okay, so getting back to language models and talking a little bit about the findings there. So do language models know filler gap dependencies? The sort of classic frustrating answer here is yes and no. It's complicated. So there's been a number of papers in recent years looking at different kinds of language models and what kinds of filler gap dependencies they know. I realize this is a little hard to read, but some of the things I want to point out here is that all of these authors have tested a certain basic kind of filler gap dependency in English, and the language models do pretty well on those across the board. So in all of these papers, basic embedded WH questions like I know what Mary bought, language models seem to understand that you need to have the filler in the gap or neither. You can't have just one, right? So using that as shorthand to say, well, it looks like it knows that fact. And this is true. They've looked at recurrent neural networks. They've looked at transformers. They've looked at models that are trained on different kinds of data, different amounts of data, and this seems to hold pretty robustly so far. They've also, various authors have looked at making the constructions a little bit more complicated. So they've added, like Wilcox et al. Looked at modulating the amount of hierarchical structure in sentences to see if, well, are the language models just learning a linear order, or are they learning something that is more complicated? And the language models do fine with that complicated hierarchical structure. They look at modulating how embedded the sentence is. I'm not going to explain what some of these things are, but if you're curious, you can ask me later. This is mostly just for people who are familiar with syntax. And Wilcox et al., as well as Lan et al., have also found that when you give language models this kind of more complicated construction called an island, these are constructions that basically never occur in natural language, like very, very rarely. They're bad. When humans hear them, we're like, that is totally ungrammatical. And the language models are able to recognize that those constructions are ungrammatical, even though presumably they were not exposed to that data, right? So already we're thinking maybe there's a little bit of generalization going on here, where if they learn this sort of basic fact, they might be able to generalize and say, when you change the sentence in certain ways, it'll get bad. In addition to WH questions, Ozaki and al. Also looked at other kinds of filler gap dependencies and found that RNNs, the ones they looked at, showed some recognition of the correct patterns when it came to things like clefs and comparatives, which I didn't go over earlier, and maybe tough constructions. So just to remind you what I mean by that, with clefs, we have the it is pattern in English, and tough constructions, we have something is tough to do or fun to do or something like that. We have a adjective and an infinitive. So just again, to kind of summarize here, the things that language models seem to know are a couple of these basic, not very common, but somewhat common constructions of embedded WH questions, and then a couple of other types of filler gap dependencies. But of course, it's more complicated than that. So there's evidence suggesting that LMs just totally fail on other kinds of filler gap dependencies. Like I said, the tough construction findings in the Ozaki paper are kind of mixed. They tested a bunch of different models and they looked at different measurements. And so some of the measurements suggested that the models know that construction, and others suggested that it didn't, right? So some of this work is hard to summarize because there's, just so many different ways you can measure the language model's knowledge. And then language models tended to do pretty bad on topicalization. So like the cake Mary bought. Lan et al., again, they looked at a whole bunch of different language models, and they tested these somewhat obscure and complicated patterns called across the board and parasitic gap constructions. And I'm not going to get into a definition of what that is. Again, you can ask me if you're interested. But the point is that when they introduce the models to something more complicated, that humans are perfectly able to deal with and say, like, that's grammatical, the models failed. So the question that this raises is like, well, maybe the models are only learning the things that they see and they're not generalizing to these more complicated patterns the way that humans have to do. So just like tying it together and starting to sort of wrap up and talk about what I think are kind of the big pictures here, and a little bit of my own work. My group is motivated by some of the findings I just talked about. So namely, the Ozaki finding that shows that language models seem to know a couple of different types of filler gap constructions. So not just embedded WH questions, but also things like clefting. And if a model demonstrates knowledge of different types of things, there's a couple different ways you can explain that. One is that the model learned each one of those separately. So it saw a bunch of WH questions and it learned WH questions. And then it saw a bunch of clefting and it learned clefting, right? But another potential explanation is, if you remember, I was talking before about the things that these filler gap dependencies have in common. Linguists have posited that there's a shared abstract underlying representation for them, such that if you were to learn the abstract representation, you might get some of the more complicated or the more rare constructions for free, or at least more easily than you would have if you had to learn each one separately. So if you hear a bunch of embedded WH questions and you figure out the generalization that there's like a filler and a gap and they have certain properties, then that might help you when you encounter other kinds of filler gap dependencies without you having to get very many examples of those, right? Because things like it is this cake that Mary bought, or topicalization, or some of the more complicated constructions I mentioned, they just don't show up in the data that language learners are exposed to. So you might, as a child, only hear some of these constructions once or twice. And that seems intuitively just like not sufficient to learn that pattern. Similarly, Lanadol showed that if you give an LM, if you retrain it and you give it a bunch more examples of a certain construction, then it can learn that construction even if it couldn't before. So they use that to argue that the data is insufficiently rich for a learner to just be using the input to come up with these generalizations. Like they're arguing that you need some sort of linguistic bias to help you do that. So our question is, if you know one type of construction as a human or a language model, does that give you any advantage in learning the other kinds? And so that might suggest that there is some sort of underlying representation that's shared across those kinds of constructions. But of course, just knowing what a model knows doesn't tell you how it got to that knowledge, right? So like I said before, if it knows construction A and construction B and construction C, it might be that it learned each one of those separately, and it might be that it learned something underlying. And you can't tell just by looking at the output. So this is where Lanadol's model retraining method comes in, which I think is pretty nifty. So like I said, they gave the LM more examples of constructions that it didn't previously, like just based on pre-training, it didn't know these constructions, but when you give them more examples, it learns that construction better. And that by itself is, I think, like not surprising, I think, if you're familiar with how language models work. But the interesting thing, I think, to pull out from this is that the language models in principle have the ability to represent these relations. They just need enough data to do so. So what my team is interested in is saying, well, instead of training them on a bunch of examples of one construction and seeing how it does on that construction on tests later, what if we train them on examples of one construction and then see if that impacts their knowledge of the other constructions in some way? So again, trying to get at that like underlying abstract knowledge somehow. Yeah, so just to wrap up, the sort of insights that I kind of want to get across, and I hope I have, is that studying language models is not the same thing as studying humans, obviously. But even stronger than that, I don't personally come from the standpoint of thinking that language models themselves, like looking into their processes, is going to tell you very much about the cognitive processes of a human. But the language models can be a lens to investigate this shared object that both language models and humans interact with, which is natural language. And so what I'm hopeful about in doing this work, and what I hope is interesting to at least a few of you, is the way in which language models can be a tool to understand language itself. And then from there, that might give us some ideas about what is in principle possible, what's learnable from the language, what the properties of the language are, and how humans themselves use that language. Yeah, and that's it. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can see the Google Meet again, but I can come back to it if people have questions. Okay. Sorry, if someone's saying something, I've somehow lost
Hello?
the window. Hi, yeah. Can you see and hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
So thank you, Allison, for this very informative presentation. If anybody like to ask a question, you can unmute your microphone and ask your questions, raise your hand, or just write in the chat if there are any questions. We have one question. Asla, go ahead.
All right. I opened my camera. Oh, yes. Hi.
Hi.
So thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I have a very naive question. I'm not really, I don't know much about NLP, so it could be a naive question, but I was thinking, because you said the NLPs, this filler gap dependencies, they generalize how they work. So that's how they are treated by LLMs. I was thinking there's this phenomenon in language acquisition where some languages, so some infants seem to make less mistakes just because of how their native languages works. In some languages, the infants, so there is some error-free language thing going on just because they also do overgeneralization, but their language it just works that way. So they seem like they're speaking in a more proficient manner, whereas the other language doesn't work that way. So they seem to make more mistakes. I was wondering if the same thing could be going on with LLMs. Like, do we know how this filler gap dependencies, how they are treated in other languages, or could it yield different results in LLMs too?
That's a really good question. And I think I know what kind of phenomenon you're talking about. So unfortunately, most of the work that I'm familiar with has just been done in English. There may be related work in other languages, but the filler gap literature, I've only seen English stuff. But my guess would be that because a language model is supposedly like linguistically neutral and isn't supposed to have any sort of bias linguistically at all, that the property of the language itself would matter a lot, right? Because that's all the language model has to work with is, you can imagine if you don't have the sort of universal grammar, like expectations that there should be, let's say you posit a universal grammar principle that a learner expects there to be tense in their language, and you're trying to figure out like how the tense is realized, right? So in that case, if you have a language that has overt morphology for tense, that might make you better at, I'm talking very loosely here, but the idea being that like, if your language lines up with your expectations better, then that might make you quicker to figure out the facts of your language, right? And less likely to make mistakes. With a language model, you don't even, if it's linguistically neutral, then you don't have those predictions at all. So all you have is whatever's overt in the data. So if you have a language where, I don't know, filler gap dependencies are not really, I think, an easy example for this, but like tense is. If you have a language where tense isn't overtly realized, then it's a little bit trickier to figure out like how a language model could figure out the facts of that language as quickly as a human might be able to. Another difference between language models and humans that I think is really important is that language models don't have any context. So there's this really great paper from 2020 by Bender and Collar, and they look at this question of like, do language models know language? Like, are they like literally cognitively able to speak language? And they have this analogy where they talk about like, when humans learn language, we're not just hearing the words in isolation, we're like interacting with objects in our environment, right? So like when I say like, this is water, I'm like, you know, there's something visually in front of you. Language models don't have that, right? They just have lots and lots and lots of words. And so if you have a language where something's not overtly realized, then I think where I'm going with this is like, if you don't have any other supporting information in the environment the way a human would, it's unclear like how a language model would be able to pick up that fact. Is that sort of, I kind of went all over the place there, but
no, thank you. Yeah. So I mean, your answer gave me one more question.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, the language models, do they, because you said, you know, that they see a bunch of words and then that's how they work. And then I was thinking, how lexical is it? So when it produces or parses sentences, does it like, let's say it sees the word book, a bunch of other words. So and then if there is like a DP comes after book, or say, this one is a verb now. So that is how it works. Then does it process lexically, or how much does it come from dependencies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's someone else at Maryland has been working a lot on this, so I'm vaguely familiar with some of this literature, but not super strongly. But my understanding is that language models can break up the language data in different ways. So the work that I'm familiar with is on morphological parsing in language models. So if you take certain models and you investigate like where it thinks the boundaries are in the morphology of a word, it's like wildly different from what humans think, right? So in the word destruction, right? Like humans would naturally break that up into the prefix D and then the root struck and the suffix shun. If you ask a language model, it might say like deest and then ruck and then T and then on, right? It's just like total nonsense. And so there's some reason to doubt that language models are parsing language in a way that's human-like in that sense. Yeah, I don't know any specific like citations off the top of my head, but it is some interesting ongoing work. Yeah, great question.
Thank you. That's all for me. Thank you. Thank you for the talk again.
Are there any other questions? If not, I have just one or two small questions, if you don't mind. Yeah. So you said for some certain filler dependencies, the language model can't learn them all right. But for some others, the model doesn't perform that well. So it's interesting to me. And like I was wondering, I read a paper by Sinclair et al. From Aberdeen University, I guess. So they were in their research, they didn't look at filler gap dependencies, but what they looked at was structural priming. So like whether, for example, once the language model sees a dative sentence with a like dative, let's say ditransitives with words like give versus sentences with the same meaning but with a preposition, let's say. So like whether they are primed the same way humans are. So they also tested GPT-2, I guess, another bunch of different models, but they found that models with fewer parameters were most human-like. So that was interesting. Like for some filler gap dependencies, would the model size be important in terms of like really acquiring that knowledge? So do you know any literature on that, or do you have any intuition on this?
That's a great question. And some of the papers that I cite in this presentation look into this directly. So if you're interested, I can send you those. But definitely, you see something similar to what you just said, which is that some of the more advanced models just seem so unhuman-like that they perform worse on these tasks. So my group is looking at GPT-2 along with a recurrent neural network from Gulor-Dava et al. From a couple of years ago. And the RNN tends to perform more in line with the human expectations than GPT-2 does. And I think I've heard of some work that once you get into like GPT-3, you're just like way far out there. So there's a sweet spot where you don't want to be using like n-grams and like really overly simple stuff. But if you start to get into the really advanced transformers, it becomes non-human-like.
I see. Thanks. I also have one other question, like very small one. So this is not directly about filler gap dependencies, but more it's like a more general curiosity of mine. So I'm going to ask you whether do you know any literature on this and so on. So there are also like these multimodal language models, right, that come out very recently. So I was wondering, so is there any line of research that actually look at visual word paradigms and trying to replicate that using, I know, because there are different psycholinguistic phenomena that we can actually use these multimodal models with. So do you know anything, or just?
I don't know anything. That's a really good question, though. Yeah. No, I'm not. All the work I'm familiar with has just been on like single modal. That's a good question.
So I'm thinking of like all the possibilities that we can actually do with these multimodal ones. So that would be really interesting, I guess.
Totally, yeah.
All right. So if there are no other questions, then we can thank Allison for being here, for presenting this very nice overview of language models and how they acquire languages. So thank you. I would like to thank you on behalf of Compec, the student club, and also on behalf of Boğaziçi University. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. So to the audience, we are going to give a 15 minutes break. Büşra will start at 7:10 Turkey time. So we can give a 15 minutes break. Then we will come back with Büşra Marşan's presentation on benchmarking in Turkish.